The Dragonpit crouched on Rhaenys' hill like a broken skull, its ribs of stone thrusting against a high blue sky. Dust lay everywhere, soft as ash. Old bones peered from the rubble, glimmering when the wind scoured them clean. The empty rings and iron anchors where dragons had once been chained stood like the cuffs of giants who had gnawed their hands free. Bats slept in the fissures. A sour tang rode the air, as if the stones themselves remembered smoke. They came to it as to a remembered fear. The unsullied filed through the ruins' arched entrances, white-tipped spears a quiet forest, ranks even as paving stones. Dothraki riders clustered beyond the gates like a dark river, their braids and bells chattering when their horses stamped. Lannister guards, red as new blood, stood in thin lines along stairways cracked by roots and time. At the center, the meeting table sat upon flattened timbers and old chains. Daenerys Targaryen came last among hers, walking in leather and winter silks, a white cloak over her shoulders. Drogon's shadow had vanished from the sky. She had left him to circle the city at a distance lest his rage at the pit's chains unmake this delicate hour. Missandei walked at Daenerys' left, quiet, composed, a ribbon of ink at her throat. To her right, Tyrion Lannister limped with watchful eyes. Behind them came Varys, as mild as a cloud that never rained, and Ser Jorah Mormont, sunburnt and stalwart, a healed scar across his chest beneath his leather. Jon Snow had reached the Dragonpit before her, standing beside Ser Davos and the grizzled men of the north. His furs looked wrong under the southern light. He wore only a sword and the pin she'd given him. When Daenerys came into the circle of stones, his gaze found hers as if it belonged there. She saw the wonder of the place reflected in him, and then the worry that had never left him since he had laid eyes upon her dragons. Across the fretted table, Cersei Lannister waited with her brother beside her and the mountain hulking behind. She had dressed herself like a blade, black glass sewn into black silk, shoulders armored, her gold hair cut to a cruel crown. Jaime wore sober gray and the gravity of a man who had seen the inside of too many vows. Qyburn stood a step off, his hands folded over each other like pale spiders. Euron Greyjoy propped himself on the balls of his feet, grinning as if the world were a poor joke he alone understood. No one spoke. Ravens circled above and did not land. The Hound broke the silence by dragging forward the heavy box they had brought up from King's Landing's underbelly. The slats rattled. He pried the locks with a crowbar. Daenerys heard Davos draw breath, Tyrion's quick step as he moved a pace back. Jon did not move. The lid lifted. The thing inside burst up. It was worse in sunlight. The white had once been a man, but the cold had thinned it to wires and cloth and teeth. It ran straight for Cersei. The chain Davos had tied jerked it up short. Its jaw clacked, its fingers clawed grooves in the dirt, and then the Hound fetched it down with a hooked spear and drove the blade clean through its shoulder while it screamed without air. Ser Jaime came forward in an involuntary step. Euron laughed. Qyburn watched with a hungry look as if he saw not horror but a set of problems. Jon moved to the white and, speaking to the Lannisters, he said the words he had said in winter halls and in smoky tents. This was what marched upon the living. This did not reason, bargain, or wait. This only devoured. He hacked at its arm until it tore loose and crawled like a pale spider. He burned it with a torch. He let the blade bite it to pieces and showed them which parts died in fire and which did not die at all until he set them alight with the resin pot the Hound shoved into his hand. The smell was grass burned in winter and old hair. Daenerys had a memory of a market square in Meereen and a child's shoe in ash. She breathed until the past receded and there was only the white dwindling and Jon's face, and the ring of faces that would decide whether the world went on. When at last the thing was nothing but charred sticks and smoking grit, silence returned. The crackle died. Cersei watched the smoke curl. "We will march," she said, and the relief that crossed the faces around her lasted only as long as a blink. "The crown will join you in the north, on condition that the king in the north swears to keep his banners from any war between queens, now and afterwards." "Swear to neutrality," she said, and her voice could have cut stone. "And we will save this world together." Tyrion's gaze slid toward Jon. Davos's fingers flexed against the table's edge. Daenerys looked at Jon and saw him turn inward toward the place where he kept his promises. It was in that instant, under the hard eye of the sun, under the hollows where dragons had once hissed, that a thought sharper than any of Tyrion's arrived at her like a thrown spear. She had seen the way these people weighed her. Not only as a queen, but as a stranger. A foreign sun still clung to her. She had seen the way the Northern Lord's eyes skipped from her to Jon and back, anxious as dogs. And Cersei's condition was not safety. It was a noose. Jon's mouth opened. Daenerys stepped forward before he could speak and said, "He cannot swear that, Your Grace." Every face turned toward her. She knew Tyrion's wariness, the way his breath thinned, but she kept her gaze on the only person who mattered. Jon's mouth shut. His eyes held hers, and she saw in them the same calculation she had just made, and also the weight of something older and more stubborn than fear. It had always been in him. A sense that one must do what was true even when truth dragged you over broken ground. "I cannot swear," he said then, steady as hills. "My banners are pledged. My sword is pledged. I have a queen." Euron made an obscene little sound. Qyburn's lids lowered in thought. Cersei's smile was the kind you'd put on a corpse, neat and false. "Your honesty does you credit," she said softly. Jaime flinched as if struck. Daenerys felt the hinge of the world creak. Time seemed to lengthen and thin. The wind lifted a curl of her hair and set it trembling against her cheek. She felt Tyrion taking a breath to try to mend what was breaking, and Missandei's quiet presence warm at her side. And in front of her Jon, who had knelt to her in a cold torchlit hall and asked that she trust him with all that was left of her heart. "Then let it be more than banners," Daenerys said. Her own voice startled her. It sounded like the day she had stared at a city's gates and thought, now or never. She turned from Cersei to Jon, not looking to see what storm of anger the Lannister queen wore now. "The realm needs one war," Daenerys said to Jon and to all of them, "and one cause. It needs one house to stand for the living, not two camps eyeing each other over a truce's line. If I am to be a foreigner forever, then let me bind myself to this land by blood and bone. If you would have me be your queen, Jon Snow, if ever there was a time for hearts to be made of more than words, make me your ally before gods and men." Missandei's breath caught. Davos made a sound that could have been a prayer. Jon stared at her. Behind him, the northern men glanced from face to face, looking for signs, for protests, for dangers. Tyrion moved his mouth as if to shape a sentence that began with "wait." The hound's lip curled as if at a bad joke. In the quiet she heard the far-off clop of a horse shifting in the street below, the whisper of a crow's wing, the scrape of the wind in the pit's old drains. Cersei laughed, cut the air like glass. "Here," she said, "you propose to wed in my city while I stand and watch?" She turned to Jaime and he did not look away. "Brother," she said with a softness that was colder than her smile, "do you hear? They would make a mockery of us." Daenerys felt the old flint within her answer. "It is my city as well," she said. "My ancestors built it." She looked at Jon and saw not a boy and not a puppet but a man who understood that the shape of history often came down to two people with a table between them, and the willingness to jump. Jon's voice when it came was low and sure. "I," he said. She had not realized she had been holding her breath until it left her. The relief was not joy. It was a release into something larger and more dangerous than before. Jon stepped around the table and came to her across a stretch of ancient dust. He stood before her, close enough that she could see how the sun picked out a single thread of silver in his black hair. "What gods?" he asked. She studied his face, the small frown between his brows that only appeared when the choice was too heavy for one man to lift. "All of them," she said. "Let them hear and fight amongst themselves. Let them choke on it," the hound muttered. He spat but stood straighter, as if even he could not help but honor such defiance. "We have no septon," Tyrion said. "No heart tree, not even Septa's bells to ring. At the very least, if we're to do this, perhaps a quieter corner," and Missandei's voice was steady, a ribbon drawn tight. "The traditions of Valyria do not require a cleric," she said. Only two, and witnesses and vows freely given. The old blood bound itself by words and by will, and the words were kept like iron. Her eyes were warm on Daenerys and at peace with the moment in a way that steadied her. If you will, your grace, I know the words. I learned them when you learned your titles. Cersei's mouth had tightened to a pale line. I will not suffer. You have suffered worse, Tyrion said, and for once bitterness did him good. He lifted one hand, palm open in a child's placating gesture. Let it be done, and we can go back to the matter of whether winter devours us all. You want their promises? What promise binds more surely than this? If they wed now, then their word is a single word. It was a gamble, and they all saw it. Cersei saw it most of all. But 100 Unsullied had their eyes upon the mountain now, and behind Cersei the sprawl of the city hung like tinder, too much for any one moment to set afire. She had been the queen who burned a sept to the foundations. She could not pretend to a fear of sacrilege now. Pride pinned her. Rage iced her. She flicked her fingers and turned her face aside in a show of indifference that could fool no one. If I am forced to stand witness to treason, she said, I shall remember every face that did not avert its eyes. Daenerys did not take her eyes off Jon. The ghosts of the pit watched too, and the black apertures where dragons had screamed. Missandei, she said very softly, and reached for Jon's hands. His palms were calloused and warm. The world drew nearer. The hum of the city faded, and there were only the breaths of the men and women around them, the muted creak of leather, the baffled flutter of a bat in some high crack. Missandei spoke in High Valyrian, her voice clear as a bell that had survived 1,000 sacking wars. The words were ancient as a broken harbor stone. Daenerys did not need the translation. She knew the sense as one knows one's own name. I am yours of my own will. I bind my days to your days. Fire to flesh, word to word. Jon's voice, rougher, caught in the turns of the language and then found its way. He spoke carefully, and the care was its own beauty. They bled together, the old right of men who had once been horse lords in the Shadowlands before Valyria, perhaps, or some Targaryen fancy. She did not know, only that the knife was sharp and simple, and that when Jon's thumb pressed against hers and their shared blood smeared red, she felt a certainty like a stone underfoot. Ser Jorah looked away a fraction. Then he looked back, and he did not flinch. Davos reached into his cloak and found a cord, rough wool. That why. Turbitten man, unable to see two hands joined without wanting them lashed firm, and he gave it to Missandei without looking at Cersei. Missandei tied their wrists with the old knot that no gust of wind could pull loose. Witnesses, Missandei said in the common tongue, and her gaze moved over the assembly. Do you stand witness? Tyrion bowed his head. Jorah did the same, and Grey Worm, silent as the point of a spear. Davos grunted. Even Varys's lids lowered in a manner that could have been reverence or calculation or both. Across the way, Jaime Lannister's mouth softened, and for a heartbeat he was the young knight who had knelt in a hall to swear vows that had once shone like the sun. Cersei said nothing. Perhaps silence itself can be a witness when it cannot prevent. Missandei said the last words. Daenerys spoke the last shape of them into the pit as into a hollow vessel and felt it fill. Jon repeated them after her, his voice surprising her in its steadiness. When Missandei loosed the cord and wound it into Daenerys' hand, the world returned all at once. The wind, the dust, the fraught faces, the distant cries of hawkers at the base of the hill calling their wares to those who would never taste them. Daenerys did not kiss him. This was not the place. She pressed her forehead a moment to his, a touch as private as a whisper, and when she drew back she saw, in the blue near his pupils, a reflection of herself small as a figure in a mirror inside a mirror. Now, she said, and her voice belonged to the give of old leather and the bend of a bow. We hunt death. Cersei's expression had become so smooth it could have been carved. Then you will do it with the full support of the crown, she said in such a terrible parody of courtesy that even Qyburn shifted. She looked at her brother. Come. She departed then, the mountain at her shoulder, Qyburn at heel. Jaime stood a heartbeat longer and managed, before turning, to incline his head a fraction toward Tyrion. enough to be an acknowledgement or a goodbye. Euron was slower to leave. He sauntered past the remains of the white, spat upon the cinders, and made sure the heel of his boot crushed them. "Wedded bliss," he said with his grin. "I was thinking to carry you off myself, Silver Lady, but I suppose some men like to ask." He laughed and sauntered out with the careless air of a man who believed himself immune to tides. When they were gone and their shadows gone with them, the Dragonpit exhaled. Tyrion turned to Daenerys and Jon and somehow kept his reproach within bounds. "In a hall of annihilated dragons," he said dryly, "you two have chosen audacity. On balance, that may be the safest choice we had." "Her condition was a leash," Jon said. "A wedding makes it a rope put around both our hands at once. I can live with that." Daenerys could not help the quick gleam of humor that rose. "I suppose that is what I did." "Let us go before 100 archers decide to honor your choice with a shower of congratulations," Davos said. "The city isn't safer for you now." They left the pit and the ghosts and came down the hill. Drogon's shadow stooped once over the roofs like a blessing or a threat. The city shivered beneath it. At the base of the hill, the wind came colder and smelled of the river. The day was so bright that the stones of the street cast black shadows like lines of ink. Daenerys's hand tightened for a moment around the cord Missandei had wound. She slipped it into her sleeve. Jon walked a fraction closer than he had before. That evening Tyrion went into the Red Keep to meet his sister and returned hours afterward with a chalk-ashen face. The kind of expression one sees on a man who has looked down a well and seen it blur forever. He had been allowed to leave, and for Tyrion that counted as a miracle. "She says she will send her armies north," he said, and did not provide a cask to hold the disbelief they all felt. "She says she will keep faith." "She lies," Varys said, so mild and certain he could have been reciting the weather. "I know," Tyrion said. He looked to Jon and Daenerys both and made the smallest bow he had ever made to anyone. "We will prepare as if she told the truth and watch as if she told the lie. Both if we can." They left at sunrise, a thin pale wash that made the black wings of the gulls look blue. The seas were winter cold. Spray rose in stings. Dothraki hated the boats and the boats hated them back. Their knots were poor and their tempers shorter. The Unsullied moved like a single organism from deck to deck. Grey Worm had the calm of men to whom fear is a thing already tallied. Gendry built barricades of crates and pegged them to the rails. No one asked him what he was thinking, and they did not have to, because he lived half in his hands. Davos cursed the wind in 3 seas tongues and taught the Dothraki a 4th. Varys vanished below and wrote letters that smelled faintly of ink and secrecy. One night, Daenerys came up from her cabin and found Jon at the prow looking north. The wind had red cheeks for him and sharpened his eyes. His cloak struck against the wood like a flag. When she came to stand beside him and laid her hand on the rail, she found it cold enough to sting even through her glove. "I did not think to wed in a ruin," she said. He huffed a breath that might have been laughter. "I never thought to wed at all," he said. "And yet you did." His glove brushed hers on the rail. He did not quite take her hand. "You said there was no place for a quiet in the world where dying walks," he said. "So we spoke loud. I hope it was the right loud. It needed to be." She stared at the line where sea met night, the foam turning silver, the swell and fall. "I think there will be a price. There always is." They were quiet a while. Somewhere below, the cooks were boiling a stew that smelled of old salt pork and new onions. On the next ship, a Dothraki was singing a song that sounded like a fight with a storm. Missandei stood unobserved in a piece of shadow and smiled like a secret when Daenerys kissed her husband's cheek and then his mouth, the gentlest touch of lips the sea had ever watched, before they each turned their faces north again. At White Harbor the banners hung heavy with frost. Wyman Manderly welcomed them with his courtesy, his caution, and pies that steamed like secrets. He called Daenerys Your Grace with no tremor, and when his eyes moved to her dragons, he looked as a man might look at a god standing in his hall and choosing not to judge him. They reprovisioned. They sent ravens to Winterfell and to houses whose snow-buried keeps held men who told stories of dragons like nightmares their grandmothers had half believed. Boats from the Vale arrived with casks and cheese and horses that stamped and blew and rolled eyes at the smell of dragon on the wind. News ran ahead of them like wildfire in dry grass. By the time they rode up the King's Road through fields of hoarfrost, every village turnip woman knew that the Dragon Queen had married the Wolf King in the very place where dragons had once been chained. Some spat and said it was an omen of ill, and some pressed hands to their mouths and wept, and some shrugged and said weddings were weddings and wars were wars, and all they wanted was to live long enough to see spring. Winterfell rose out of the snow like a memory that refused to melt. Smoke plumes stood straight in the still air. The Godswood's red crown lifted in bare veins and fanned brown above the black pool. The ravens in its boughs grumbled, as if displeased at all the change the world had suffered while they'd slept. When the gates opened, the cold slid like a blade into her lungs. Dany tasted iron and pine. Jon's grip on his reins tightened. His mouth tilted in a way she had learned meant he was changing from one face to another, from the boy who laughed near fires and said little to the man who stood before old stone and let it measure him and find him unchanged. Sansa was wading in gray wool and ice. She had the castle at her back and the north in her eyes. Arya stood a half-step behind and a half-step aside, where a hand could reach for a dagger and no one would see. Bran sat in his chair by the door, his blankets tucked up around him, his gaze elsewhere, as if the winds that riffled the weirwood's leaves moved some other tree in some other place unnoticed by anyone else. "Your Grace," Sansa said to Daenerys, and the form was exact. The temperature of it could have killed a small animal. She turned her face to Jon and it softened, but not so much as it once had. "Brother," she said. "Husband," she added then, and 1,000 unspoken measurements lay between those two words like knives between lovers in a story. "Lady Sansa," Daenerys said. "My sister." She made of the last word a courtesy that might grow roots if tended. "Thank you for your haul." "You'll have it," Sansa said. "What we have, we share, as we always have, though I'd have liked to be asked before I learned from a raven that Winterfell had a new liege lady." "It has the same," Jon said. "It has me. It has the dragon as ally." He said it gently, yet steel lay under it. Sansa's glance flickered toward the dragons in the sky like torn banners. "We have no lack of allies when snow falls," she said softly. "We lack food." "We brought what we could," Tyrion said from behind. "And I told my queen that northern kitchens are as close to sorcery as this land boasts. I hope I did not lie." Sansa looked at him in a way that said she had not forgotten a bit of their marriage, neither insult nor kindness. Then she looked past him to the Unsullied and the Dothraki and the stream of people behind, a river of need running up against the stout stones of her home. "We'll have to count it all," she said. "Everything." Daenerys judged her then and found in Sansa neither the petty jealousy of a jilted steward nor the brittle vanity of a little queen, but the clean, tight worry of a guardian in a winter that would not end. She bowed her head a fraction. "Teach me how Winterfell survives. I have not spent enough winters anywhere." Sansa blinked as if that had not been the weapon she expected. "Very well," she said. "We begin with barley." They set to survival. The war would come when it chose. Hunger was here already. Fires burned around the clock. Men stripped rust from old chain shirts and fitted new rivets. Gendry's hammers spoke. Children carried baskets. Pools of dragonglass arrowheads grew like night grapes. Spears were stacked by the dozen. The armory's racks filled and emptied like a bellows. The smith of Winterfell was a woman of 50 who used her tongs like a second, stronger hand and never raised her voice. Gendry learned he loved watching her work the way he had loved watching the sea and did not know yet what that meant for him. Above all, Daenerys learned the old slow patience of cold places. The way you measured would by the hour of heat it gave instead of by cord. The way you walked a yard less than you desired to save your breath for when something would truly need it. She stood sometimes at the edge of the Godswood and watched the weirwood's red leaves shivering and thought of the marriage they had made among dragon chains, and knew that if the North took her at all it would take her the way a winter takes a southern girl. Slowly, thoroughly, and only if she came every day and worked, and never asked to be thanked. For 3 days the sky was a coverlet, low and soft and gray. On the 4th day it lifted so clear that they could see all the way to the broken fields where once men had hunted near the Bar Rolands. And on the 5th they saw a cloud where no cloud should be. A line of smoke all along the east under a sky that tasted like iron when the wind came from that quarter. A raven brought the letter while men were still pointing from the battlements and saying it was nothing. It was everything. The wall had fallen at Eastwatch by the sea. The news broke like a plate in a quiet room. Davos carried it in his mouth as if it burned. Bran, though he did not have to be told, did not look away. Sansa went still in a frightening way no one else but Arya saw at first. She saw because she had learned to watch for stillness that preceded the terrible. Arya's fingers brushed her sister's, quick and careless-looking as a swallow's wing. Daenerys went to Jon. She had no words worth that news. He took her hand and squeezed as if to reassure her she was not alone, though it should have been for him that reassurance. It should have been the North taking the South's hand. "We need to light the beacons," he said to all of them. "We will have days, maybe a week. We make every arrow we can. We finish the trenches. We put dragonglass in places we don't think we'll need, and then we plan to need it anyway." Tyrion looked at the map and pushed small stone wolves and lions and towers into new places, and they were all wrong, and then Grey Worm took the wolves and made new places for them with his spear's shaft on the parchment. Ser Jorah moved pins to the east wall. Sansa drew little lines where the missing storms would cut across the Godswood at the height of night, because she knew where winds came through Winterfell in January that no man from Dragonstone could guess. Daenerys listened. Then she went to the yard and stood with Drogon until his great eye moved to her, and they breathed the same cold at the same moment, and he understood something was different now and folded himself nearer. They sent south for men who would not come and knew it, and sent east for men who might, and sent west to women with daughters who could pull bowstrings. It all seemed too little and too late and too small, and it would have to be enough. When the dead arrived, they did not arrive like a tide. They came like a silence. The first sign was the snow in the Godswood going perfectly still. Then the ravens rose like a torn piece of the sky. Then the breath of every horse in Winterfell hung fat as a tree root and did not move with the slightest wind. On the wall, a boy laughed because he was 14 and brave enough to laugh at the end of the world. The laugh was eaten by the quiet like a candle between two fingers. They hit the outworks before the horn blew. They came as a wall because they were a wall. The end of everything takes the simplest shape, and the Unsullied met them with a line so straight the gods might have hung the world's measure on it. The Dothraki went out and burned because they had to. Their Aurochs whispered and their bells sang, and some of them rode into a kind of song they had always been born for. Their lights went out by dozens and then by hundreds, and yet enough lived to return with burning sashes, screams in their throats and laughter. Both sounded alike under the cold. Drogon went up. Rhaegal went with him. Jon had said, quietly, that he would ride if she wanted it, and she had wanted it, because if they lost him they would lose all that bound flesh to will. He had touched the dragon's side with a hand that did not shake, but only because he had set aside fear so deliberately that it might have felt insulted. The dragon had bent his head in an acceptance that surprised even Daenerys. The old stories had not always been wrong. Blood called to blood. They flew out into a night alive with snow that the dead had brought with them like a cloak. The storm was not above them. It was all around. The first time she lost sight of Jon, Daenerys felt such a tearing as she had never expected the world could contain. She screamed his name into snow and heard no answer and flew higher and felt the cold reach for her bones. And then she saw him, just a shadow on a cloud's back. Rhaegal banking Jon's gravity on him like a hand. She could not see the ground. She killed by faith, by heat, by memory of where trenches lay. She struck where Grey Worm's men had planned they would need fire most, even when fire could not be seen. The Night King's dragon came ragged and blue and beautiful and wrong. Viserion's flame was a cold unthing. Where it touched, the world changed from one kind of death to another. If she had paused long enough to name what she felt when she saw him, she would have been ash where she flew. She did not name it. She and Jon broke and wheeled and drew Viserion away in a dance that had nothing to do with grace and everything to do with love practiced as craft. They kept him busy. They kept him away from the Godswood where the still boy and the red leaves and the last hope of men were gathered. Below, in the hall's black mouth, the living held. Brienne's shield cracked and was replaced. Jaime's sword arm bled. The hound ran from a wall of living flame and then ran back to it because Arya Stark dragged him by the courage in her voice, and he could not hold away from that. Yora died beneath the tree because some men are faithful until the world ends and then faithful after. Daenerys knew it without knowing how. Theon died where he had always meant to die. Before a boy who had become a lantern in a place with no moon. When Bran said, "You are a good man," Theon finally believed it, and so did Arya, who heard it threaded through the wind, though she would tell no one ever. No one slew the Night King with dragonfire. They burned him and he basked. Jon saw it and understood and shouted into the storm, and no one heard him. Arya heard, because she had learned to hear the words men did not mean for her from the day she had learned to throw sticks at boys twice her size. She came into the gods' wood under a snow that hid knives. She came the way water comes, quietly, flowing around what stopped lesser things. She did not fly. She did not run. She fell from a tree like a piece of night, and the knife went where winter forgot it had a heart. He caught her, and she let him, because letting yourself be caught is sometimes how you reach the place that matters. She changed hands. She learned that even the oldest stories leave room for a girl who refuses to be told where to stand. When the Night King shattered, when that frost blue light went out like the first star at dawn, Daenerys was dropping from the sky toward the godswood. Jon was shouting her name, and his dragon's wings were ragged, and she tried to turn Drogon too fast, and he screamed in reproach and saved her from her own learning. The army of the dead fell like puppets whose strings were burnt, and the world was quiet again except for a sound under it of weeping and of 1,000 men and women trying to remember how to hold breath. Dawn came bruise-colored. The dead were counted, and the living, and the space between those numbers was a canyon. Lyanna Mormont was dead. She had killed a giant and would never see summer. Ed had fallen with his questions still on his lips. Men who had been farmers 2 months ago now had hands that shook when they tried to lift a spoon. That night there was drinking because there had to be, and laughter because you could not survive without it. Gendry found his name, and not just the one given at birth. The name of Storm's End came to him with Daenerys' hand on his shoulder and her voice strong. And if any muttered at the impropriety of a queen dispensing lands like bread in a room where small folk bled, those mutters died under the relief that ran like rain over dry ground. Sansa watched and took note. Tyrion's gaze flicked to where Jon stood at the edge of the hall watching his wife as if he had never married her at all and was trying to account for the shape of the thing he had done. Across the crowded room, Missandei took Grey Worm's hand under the table, and he did not pull away, though he did not know how to hold it. The next day Bran sent for Jon. He did it without words. A raven flew to the window and rapped until Jon raised the latch, and then Bran said from the chair where he had become Winter's prophet, "I suppose I must tell you now." And Sam was there, Sam with a leather-bound book and fear on his good face. And Daenerys found them because Missandei told her where Jon had gone, and because she was her husband's wife now, and because some doors you do not let lovers go through alone. Bran told a story. It seemed a simple thing when spoken aloud, the way most true things are simple. A prince had wed a girl he loved. A child had been born. A war had entered the world like an animal through a dog door, and the child had been hidden under a false name and grown into a man, and the man had met a queen. But the truth was not merely that. It was the history of half a world. It was blood and fire braided back together in a way no one then alive had planned. Jon's silence when the words settled was larger than the room. He stood as if someone had asked him to stand for his own execution. The snow slid off the windowsill outside the tower's small window with a sound like a sigh. The candle between them burned without wavering and did not gutter, and that seemed cruel. "I am not that name," he said finally. "You are," Bran said, not unkindly. Daenerys heard the waves of what this meant before she felt their cold. She saw them come. The men who would use this to make her foreign again. The women who would whisper into their husbands' ears that kings had better taste than queens and that dragons should be saddled with northern manners. The simple fact that the child of Rhaegar and Lyanna, born of marriage with all its weight, could make of her a consort or a figurehead or a story told about the queen who might have been. She also heard the waves that broke from the other shore. The open path to unity, to ending the question of conqueror and conquered with a rope tied between two hearts in a place where dragons had once been chained. She watched her husband. He turned his face to her, and she saw in him not ambition, and not fear of losing her throne, and not even fear of his own blood, but the terror of hurting her with this truth. It made her love him more, and it did not make this easier. "We will not bury this," Daenerys said. She felt Tyrion's caution like a hand on her shoulder, though he was not there. She shook it off in the soul. "We will not make secrets out of blood. Secrets have killed enough of us in this world. But we will choose how the realm hears it." "It chooses for itself," Jon said, because he could not help trying to be fair even when fairness was a knife. "It does," she said. "But we are the ones at this table. The realm must see that we govern it together, or it will tear us apart and die in the tearing." He started to speak. Awkward, sincere words about stepping aside, and she spoke over him very gently and very fiercely. "No. Do not rob me of the husband I chose and the ally I demanded, because some old men will clutch their pearls under their furs. Do not make yourself a martyr to a thing that may not need one. You told me yourself, we are stronger together. Let us be that." Sam, who loved them both more than he loved good sense, began to cry and then to laugh at himself for crying and then to cry again. Bran watched them with an expression that might, on someone else's face, have been a blessing. They called a council in the Great Hall. The Lords of the North were stiff. The Lords of the Vale looked like men who had married into a large, loud family and were trying to find their quiet corners. The free folk grinned and did not care. Daenerys took Jon's hand in front of them all because that had been the corner of the world where they had placed their rope. She told the truth without adornment. She told it as if she expected no one to faint, and no one did. There were murmurs and arguments in corners. Some men went to put their heads together with other men whose fathers had entangled lineages before them, and some women too, because this was not the old N. Orth that had known only old men in corners. Lyanna Mormont was dead. Her aunt stood for Bear Island and spoke as if she cracked ice with her teeth when she did. Sansa listened and said little, which frightened some and impressed others. Arya's eyes flicked everywhere at once, keeping count of who reached for knives and decided not to in the end. In the night after that day of telling, Daenerys lay awake and listened to Jon's breath. It was as steady as a man who had decided he would not drown, no matter what weight a sea tied around his ankles. She thought of what she had lost and what she might lose. She thought of how the world had used her as a piece before she had been old enough to know her own hand. She thought of her brother's face and destroyed it with a thought once more. She thought of a world where children in a valley in the Stormlands said the pledge to the crown with love and not fear, and where the North sent bread in autumn because it was strong and the Reach sent men in winter because it was wise. She thought of holding a rope with both hands and not asking whether it cut her skin. In the end, she slept because dawn would come. All dawns came, or else none would. They buried their dead with burnings and with cairns. In the gods' wood, the snow fell cleanly after a day of smoke. Jon stood before the heart tree and Daenerys at his side, because she had begun now to stand in places where roots went like water beneath her. The red leaves brushed her hair lightly, as if smelling a stranger's crown and accepting it with the politeness trees have when they cannot make their wishes plain. She closed her eyes and made what prayer she could, which was only, "Let me do no evil that I can avoid." Spring would not come soon enough. The South still held an army and a queen who loved power more than breath. They were too hungry and too tired for grand plans. Perhaps that saved them, because precision came where ambition might have blinded them. They marched when they could. They rode dragons low over marshes so the reeds bent like hair, and men in the boats below saw what it meant to be under the shadow of mercy, and began to imagine a world where that shadow sheltered rather than burned. Cersei had not marched north, and no one was surprised. She had used time as a whip and driven men in the kettlebacks and gold cloaks and sellswords into line. She had scorpions on the walls and scorpions mounted on wagons and scorpions hidden on balconies and under tarps, so that when a certain angle of sun struck, a nearby cat howled and ran, and a woman dropping a bundle of faggots started and cut her thumb on a wire. Euron had a fleet that chewed at the sea. It stank of pitch and carnage. He had had an artist in the islands paint eyes on the prows of his ships that made small fishermen turn and row another way for fear of being called to some feast in the deeps. They did not go straight for King's Landing with dragons blazing. Instead, they went to the source of the scorpions and cut off the frog's head. Davos found them a man who had worked in the city for Qyburn, a riveter with 3 daughters. The man had been paid in wine and promises, and his oldest daughter had died of a cough no one had taken the time to stop. He told them where the big workshops were, and where the small ones were, and where the men took their dinners, and where the shutters did not quite close on the riverside at midnight when the wind had a certain tone. Yara Greyjoy came with ships whose mainies snapped. Gendry made arrows that bent once and then never bent beyond. Missandei went among the women in the outer city and spoke in a voice that never sounded like it came from a throne, and told them not to go near the walls on the day the sky would change, and they listened because enough had begun to trust that this golden-haired queen was not another word for fire. On the day they chose, the wind came northwestern like a knife off the hills. The sea ran low in the morning and high by noon. Euron's ships had strayed farther out, chasing a raider from Lys that would bring them no wealth and 2 dead men and a story. Drogon came up from the estuary like a storm fathered on some deep trench, and Regal with him. Both dragons scarred now with winter and with duty. They did not scream. Their silence was a violence of its own. They flew so low that their wings stirred the tarp edges where scorpions hid. They flew so high the bolts could not reach them. They flew at angles a carpenter would have to measure twice to believe possible. They destroyed half the scorpions by means of men's own caution. The other half they unmade with fire that stuck to ropes and caught them. Yara's ships came in behind Euron's. There is a way a sailor knows how to fall windward of a man he hates and ride his wake until the moment the hated man realizes his mouth is open and his teeth are being counted. Yara did that. Davos taught her a trick that had been old when he was born. They came in from the glare so the enemy eyes watered and tipped into the wind at the last moment. Euron's laughter, when his masts toppled one by one, could have been weeping if you heard it without seeing the face. By the time Drogon came to the walls, too many scorpions were cold to turn. Regal's wings clipped a tower and he screamed. Jon felt it in his bones, a desolation, and then the dragon steadied, and the wall that had held kings since the Conqueror's time stood looking up at something that remembered the men who had built it. They burned only what they had to. They burned the bolt racks and the evergreen ladders and the piles of pitch. They burned the empty outer granaries rather than see them used by men who would starve peasants to feed soldiers. The city did not burn because Daenerys had chosen a different brand of history. Inside the Red Keep, Qyburn ran down a corridor with a scroll in his hand and a thought already dead before dawn had even warmed it. Cersei stood at a window and watched the dragons in their erase and redraw and held her hands very still at her sides. Jaime stood with her, and the light on his face was not gold and not gray. It was the light of a man who had finally completed the circle of his life and found himself back at a point where he could choose again. Tyrion came to a side postern with a white flag and a face that looked older than his father's had ever been. Brienne and Grey Worm and Ser Davos flanked him. Arya was a shadow beyond that could have been a rumor if not for the way even seasoned men's eyes slid away from her whenever she turned her head. "I am here to offer terms," Tyrion said when he stood in the outer court. He said it to a captain of the city watch who had thought himself a man until he looked up at a dragon's belly. "You can save all their lives," Tyrion said, and he had never sounded so much like a son in his life, pleading with a parent who would not be moved. "Open the gates. Lay down arms. The queen will accept your surrender." The bells did not ring because they did not have to. Men began to drop weapons like men who had been carrying rocks and found their fingers tired. A woman laid her basket of carrots down and stepped back, her palms open as if ready to receive whatever came next. The captain closed his eyes. Cersei did not flee to the crypts. She went to the throne room. It was all theater now, and she knew it. She had always been the best actress in this city. She stood behind the chair where 1,000 decisions had hung men and saved them too. The mountain stood where he had always stood, a ruin in armor. Qyburn came panting with a plan in his hand that she did not take because the paper was only paper and the world out there was dragons and oaths. It was Jaime who reached her first. The Hound and the mountain found each other at the base of the stair and turned the palace into a place that imploded upon their hatred. They died as they had always been meant to die, in a place where men left them alone to finish their private war. The Red Keep shook and dust fell like lacy snow. Jaime looked at his sister, and for a second they were children again, and you could almost hear the grass in their father's garden and the last notes of dusk when the world had seemed to run only to their measure. He said, "It's done." Not yet, she said. It is, he said. And the words broke something in him that needed to be broken for the man they all needed him to be to live. She raised her chin, and the light on her clean-cut hair was a crown he had never seen before. Do you remember when Father taught us that power is where men believe it is? She said. I did. I believed it until I made it true. And now you can make something else true, he said. He took her hand, and it was very cold. You can make mercy true. She laughed once. That is not a word I know, she said. But she let him lead her down the steps. They met Tyrion at the threshold of the ruined lower hall. He looked like a man in a story who had returned to the house of his youth and found it grown small. Cersei, he said, and almost bowed because old habits ride us like men on mules. He mastered himself. Surrender. This is your last chance to be remembered for more than your cruelties. I will always be remembered for my cruelties, she said, and did not sound proud. What else is there? There is how you end, he said. She stood very still. In the quiet, someone far away cried out and was answered with a voice that promised no harm. At last she lifted the hem of her dress and stepped out into the courtyard with her hands up like a woman stepping into a river she cannot see the bottom of. When Daenerys walked into the city she had not burned, the people looked at her with a kind of unsteady awe as if they kept expecting to see smoke come from her hair. Jon walked beside her with Regal's shadow moving across his face. She saw the dying and felt in her the old iron-willed, fire-true part of herself that would always want to end things hard. And she held it in one hand and the other hand held Jon's. And she breathed until the urge went out of her like steam from a kettle left off the fire. They set terms that did not flatter anyone. The Lannister armies that laid down arms were sent home in 2s and 10s, with food tokens and orders to return if called by a crown they had not believed in yesterday and were learning to give another kind of allegiance to today. The sellswords who put their weapons in piles were paid a portion of what they were owed and given passage out. Those who stayed were given brown cloaks and hard bread and warned, kindly, that to live in a city you do not love means learning to love something else or you will always be hurt by its smallest noises. Qyburn lived, because killing him would have been neat and neatness is rarely wise. He was sent to the citadel wearing shame like a second skin and forbidden to use a scalpel as long as he drew breath. Cersei was kept in a tower that had once held worse and not so worse men. She was visited by no one for a month. Then she was visited by Tyrion and then by Jaime, and then by no one again because she asked and because mercy sometimes looks like letting a person choose their loneliness. There was a council again in the Dragonpit because perhaps some places demand to be rewritten with better words. The bones still lay, the bats still slept, but the weeds had crept in further and one of the anchors had cracked and collapsed, and grass grew where dragons had died, fragile and stubborn. The lords came, Edmure Tully, older and deeply relieved to be asked anything besides to stand in a corner. Yohn Royce with his square-set jaw. Glover sent a letter and grudging thanks for the winter's victuals and no man. That was perhaps better. The Reach sent a woman who knew how to tally in her head and how to flirt with a balance sheet. The Dornish sent a man and a woman together who spoke alternating sentences in a way that soothed half their audience and unsettled the rest. The Faith sent a septon with gentle eyes and careful hands. He declined to officiate anything but prayers, speaking politely and with a frankness that pricked no one. Bran came, wheeled by Podrick of all people, somehow smiling despite the iron of his duty. Sansa came in a dress the exact shade of old snow. Arya came and kept to shadows until it suited her not to. Missandei sat with parchment and wrote down more than might have seemed necessary. Varys sat with his listening stillness. Davos joked when no one else could and was solemn when everyone else had grown foolish. Tyrion spoke first because it had always been his curse and his gift. We have two paths, he said. One is called pretend nothing has changed. The other is called admit everything has. I propose the second. We can make of this union, of this marriage and this lineage and this war that we have survived, a thing that will hold for longer than any of us. He laid out something that had the bones of old ways and the necessary skin of new. The North would keep its heart and its freedom in ways that satisfied the stories it told itself, yet be bound by bonds stronger than fear to the rest of the realm. Trade promised, men sent in need, bread shared in famine. The crown would be 2 heads and 1 body. Decisions made openly, written down, tally marks beside each for and against like sums. Great lords would be made to come and sit in hard chairs in rooms with poor light twice a year and say what they wanted aloud to faces they hated. The small folk would be asked what they needed, not every day but oftener than never, and the asking would have teeth because sometimes a baker knows more about a city than its mayor. Justice would be written in sentences short enough that a boy could learn them and a girl could teach them to her older brother. Sansa stood. The hall seemed to tilt an inch toward her. "The North will be no one's again but its own," she said. "We have died for that sentence too often to set it aside." She looked at Jon and then at Daenerys and measured them with affection that hurt. "But we could stand alongside a crown that respects us," she said. "We could carry our part and share in what is shared, if we are not told to kneel as children to a mother who does not listen." Daenerys did not bridle. The habit was there, and she let it come and go like a small wave. "I am no one's mother," she said simply. Her voice carried. "I will be your ally or your enemy, but not your mother. I want your aid because it is wise, and I offer mine because it is right. I took this city without burning it because I chose to believe in a world with more words than fire. Let me keep believing that. Walk with me. If I fail you, do not walk with me any longer." In the end, there was no acclamation, no sudden roar of applause. There were nods. There were calculations done in 3 different heads on either side of one table. There was the sound of grass moving against stone in a place where once only the clink of chains had been heard. A treaty was written, dry as dust and twice as nourishing. Men and women took up quills who had once only taken up swords. An old man coughed into a kerchief, and no one noticed because they were arguing the clause about who sat in a council when both sovereigns slept, and someone had to wake only one of them to choose whose turn it was to be roused. After, in a courtyard where ivy had begun to try its luck on a long-dead trellis, Jon stood with Daenerys and looked at the city below. Smoke rose, always smoke, but here and there the smoke was hearth smoke and not the kind that comes of sacking. The bells lay silent in their towers. No one felt like making them speak. "We will never be simple again," Jon said. "We never were," Daenerys said. She had taken off her cloak. Her shoulders were bare to the sun. A small scar at the curve of her collarbone gleamed white. "But perhaps we can be plain." He smiled with only half his mouth. "Plain? Honest, then?" She nudged him with her shoulder. "Not grand. Enough." He took her hand. It still surprised her that he sought it first. "We will not have children," he said, and hated himself for the bluntness. His eyes were bright, and not from joy. "Or we might. I don't know. The world has put too many prophecies in us, and I am tired of them." "So am I." She watched a hawk tilt its wing and drop. "If we do, we will name them after people who deserved it. If we don't, we will name laws and bridges and debts forgiven after those people instead. Let songs be about boys and girls who got to keep what they earned, not only about the ones who burned or were burned." He turned and kissed her in the plain light. Below them, a woman shook a rug out a window and scolded the child who had dragged it there in the first place. Life went on in the way life does when power stops trying to be the only story in the room. Tyrion stood at a balustrade and drank sour wine and looked thoughtful. Missandei laughed at something Grey Worm had said very seriously. Arya held a map she had drawn herself and considered the western blank. In the months that followed, they built and they broke and they built again because that is the shape of peace. They sent men with measuring chains into alleys and discovered where the city's sewage ran. Daenerys walked among the people so often that men stopped bowing to her because there is only so often you can bow and still get bread delivered on time. Jon learned the names of the barrel men at the mud gate and told them to call him by whatever name their mouths could manage. Some called him Your Grace and some called him Snow because that was what he was to them, and he did not correct them. Cersei stood trial and said nothing. It was not the performance the city expected. It was clean and brief and without spices. She was sent to a keep in the Trident and would die. There 3 years later, in bed, with a bad winter cough and a last smile that was perhaps not a smile at all. Jaime swore fealty to the crown and then asked leave to go to the Riverlands to rebuild a war-torn region because perhaps that was the penance that fit him. And he did it, with a straight back and a hand that learned to be taught. Tyrion wrote him once a month. Sometimes Jaime answered. Varys took his birds and turned them into a way of listening that did not always end in anyone's death. Sometimes he went to a village with a message about grain, and sometimes about mercy that needed to be extended beyond the letter. Sansa reigned in the north with a firm, spare hand and an exact eye for what men had begun to think they could keep too much of, until they learned that a winter queen sees the little hoard as clearly as the large. Arya went west and wrote letters that used few words and many drawings and told stories about islands where birds wore iridescent coats and sang like glass. Grey Worm took Unsullied to Noth, not because he was banished there by grief, but because he had begun to believe in a world that could shelter men like him and women like Missandei, and Noth needed that shelter. He came and went with the seasons like a reasonable tide, and his warriors learned that standing in a field with spears that were never thrown could be as powerful as any battle if the world knew why they did it. Missandei traveled with him often and returned often, and taught a school in the city where girls learned accounts and boys learned to pour wine without spilling, and both learned their letters, and some learned to be couriers between far places because the new realm needed messages more than it needed whispers. Gendry stood on the seawall of Storm's End and breathed salt. He married or he did not, depending on the day you asked him. He never lost the habit of showing up at a forge and taking a burned iron rod in his hand and reminding himself that work is a kind of prayer. Brienne and Podrick made a book together that measured in neat lines everything that had ever sat a horse in white armor and either lived up to it or didn't. They wrote the truth and let it sit in the world like a rock that will not move even if you push. On a morning in late autumn, when the oaks were fire and the air had the taste of apples and smoke, Daenerys went alone to the Dragonpit. She had had the weeds trimmed back and planted the low places with thyme, so the wind would smell like kitchens instead of like beasts long dead. The old anchors shone where oil had been applied. The chains rusted anyway because iron remembers what it is to be iron. She stood where she had stood when she had bound herself to this land and to the man who had taught her how to speak to it. She remembered the clean, insane courage of that day, the way silence had turned to something else under the weight of their words. She remembered her first husband, a boy with braids and a horse who had taken her across a world she had not meant to ride, and the loss that had turned her into something the world could not unmake. She remembered her brother and how the memory of his death had stopped being sweet and sour and had become simply a distant taste she no longer craved. Jon came to her because he had learned where she went when she wanted no one and still wanted someone to know where she was. He did not speak. They stood together until the sun slipped, and then he said, "You know, I thought once that mistakes are made loud and courage is quiet, but I think sometimes courage is the loudest thing we ever do." She took his hand. The scar where they had bled together the day they had married had faded to a pale seam, barely visible now unless you knew to look for it. "We did the loud thing," she said. "And now we do the plain ones," he said, smiling at last. "The little ones, the ones that take more strength. We will make mistakes," she said. "We always do." They walked the circle of that old ruin, the same old bones looking on. The bats slept and did not mind. A child's laughter drifted faintly up from a street below. It skittered over the stones and came to rest somewhere near a place where the chains had once rubbed grooves deep enough to collect rain. The wind carried the smell of the sea and of soup and of 1,000 fires burning under pots and not under trusses. The city below them was not innocent. Cities never are. But it had learned something, perhaps, about the difference between a conqueror who takes and a sovereign who tends. The realm had learned something too. It had learned that sometimes, in the very place where things had been bound in misery, you could bind them again in love, and the bond could hold. Night came up from the river, gentle as a wool blanket, and the stars climbed the black like hands over a low wall. In the dragon pit the grass moved and then was still, as if it too were listening to a story being told not with words but with the quiet heave and fall of two chests side by side in the dark. The wind stopped. For one brief moment the world was as calm as a room where a sleeping child has finally turned onto their back and made a noise like the smallest question and found no one needs to answer it because the answer is all around. They left that place as they had entered it once before, hand to hand. The city took them in. The realm, with all its old habits and its new bargains, made space for their steps. Above it all, in a sky that kept what light it could for as long as it could, dragons like shadows moved. No longer lords of men, not beasts of burden either, but something remembered and beloved that did not need to be stretched across every story. They were themselves. Jon and Daenerys were themselves. The world, which had done its worst and then its best to them, turned its great wheel and found itself in a new rut that, with luck and work, would grow to be a road. In the morning there would be counsel. There would always be counsel. There would be the dull arguments about dying coins and the small thrill of a farmer given leave to speak first and the maddening arithmetic of grain. There would be messages to Noth and to Winterfell. There would be an old woman newly come from the Crownlands asking to be made a citizen of someplace she could not pronounce because she liked the taste of the apples there better than here. There would be laughter. There would be waking in a shared bed and knowing that the rope around their hands had never been cut and neither of them wished it to be. There would be the work of peace, which is longer than the work of war and heavier and much more worth the backache at dusk. There would be love, uneven and flawed, and the particular shape of two people who had been asked to be more than themselves and had found a way to be precisely themselves and let that be more than enough. The Dragonpit watched them go and said nothing because stone says nothing, and because once, in the life of a city, it is the better part of wisdom to let a silence stand where once there had been screaming. And somewhere beyond the city's low hum of dawns to come, in a north that had kept its winters and its pride, the heart trees breathed cold and red and did not deny what had been made. And in the south where sand remembers every step, the dunes reshaped themselves around new feet and did not crumble. And to the west where the map ran blank, a ship's sail bellied and a young woman laughed at the line between fear and freedom and found it hard to feel under her hand. It was not a perfect world, for such worlds are only told in children's lies. It was a kept world, kept faith with itself as best it could, kept time with ordinary feet. And when a child years from now, this day already turned to a story, would ask why the bells didn't ring for war when the dragons came, a mother would say, because sometimes the people in the story make a different noise. And the child would say, like what? And the mother would say, like this. And the two of them would say nothing together and listen to the quiet and hear in it a promise kept.